they're seeing on these images and outright blatant efforts to cover up certain objects, and no one is asking questions. And it's because everybody's waiting for someone else to start the dialogue. Big Daddy NASA has said this is the Mars that exists. And what is astonishing and very disturbing is that even with this internet, this incredible tool for distributing alternatives and new information and allowing people to dialogue and discourse, the number of people willing to break ranks and say, wait a minute, the emperor doesn't have any clothes, or he's cloning them in his Photoshop and putting them over the pictures, are very few. I had a very interesting example. One of our geologists the other night, who is a consultant for the Parsons Engineering Company, has a colleague that he's worked with for many years, and the two have kind of drifted apart on this issue of Mars, because Ron has become very closely identified with the work of Enterprise and with looking at these images. He was present by videotape the night of the Pasadena presentation, and he'll be involved in the final video. His colleague has not been following this work at any great degree. It wasn't literally until the other day when they had a chance to sit down at the same computer and Ron said to his friend Jim, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. And Jim, who has saved thousands of these pictures on his computer and had looked at them but hadn't looked at them. And when Ron pointed out the things that were anomalous, Jim said, holy cow, and has now promised to spend the weekend looking, and a dialogue and a questioning process and an obvious, this does not belong, this is not geology, this is not what we were taught. But he'd been looking at these pictures since July and himself had not come to the obvious conclusion, because the imprint of NASA can do no wrong and would not lie was overwhelmingly clouding his vision of simply looking at the pictures themselves.
I'm just grateful that, as you alluded to earlier, people in NASA are releasing pictures. There's something happening there where there's some breaking ranks.
I wanted to pick up on that. It's a very crucial point, Madeline, and it goes back to my, this mantra. Most of the system is honest. I was doing an interview for Atlantis Rising magazine on this, which will come out, I guess, next month. And I said something, and the reporter stopped me. He said, say it again, I want to write this down. I said, they have been fooled, but they're not fools. Meaning that you have three populations within NASA, which is kind of a subculture of society in general. You have a tiny, tiny handful of what I'll call the manipulators. You then have a tiny, tiny handful of those that, for want of a better name, I'll call enlighteners. Meaning there are this duality, these polar opposites of a tiny group in NASA which tries to keep us from ever finding out what's really out there, and another group that surreptitiously has been trying to leak for years, and I can go through, if we had the time, all the other examples of things that we have on the public record that we wouldn't have if the suppressors, this first group, had had their way. I mean, they just want to burn the negatives. So there's got to be a counterforce group that has put this stuff there and somehow politically kept it available for those who would look. And in the middle, in this kind of Gaussian curve, are most of the people, which includes most of society, who are not fools but have been fooled. And it's that battle for the middle, for the intelligent, curious, connected middle, that this conflict is being waged, for the hearts and minds of those where they vote, where they ask questions, where they look, where they put their discernment, will tell us if we're going to win, meaning we get at the truth, or we never find out.
What a perfect time to open the phones to our listeners. And I'd like to invite you at this time to call 818-985-5735. Direct questions or comments to Richard Hoagland. And we'll take our first call. Hi, you're on the wee hours.
Good evening.
Hi.
Richard.
Yes, sir.
God bless you, Richard. I was just driving home after washing my car.
Is this Randy?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. An old friend. Actually, he's kind of a young friend, but he's an old familiar friend.
But your voice wasn't very familiar. It sounded like you've been having a cold for a month and a half, Richard.
I'm down from 1.5 miles. I'm at sea level again. And it's late.
And it's late.
And I've had a long day.
And you've been speaking endlessly.
And the lines are blazing, Randy. So
listen, Richard, I'm going to give you a quote here that seems to be pertinent to many things you stated. From a book that came out in 1970. And since the theme is politics, the U.S. space program apes the old hardware economy of the pre-electric age. Electric space is not outer, but inner. NASA could have created anti-gravitational transportation long ago, except for the rear-view mirror obsession of the scientific establishment. That came out in a book in 1970. That quote was made by none other than someone who had a great insight into NASA and many other statements, namely Marshall McLuhan, of all people. And since you have an insight into whether or not we have developed anti-gravitational technology, one of the other videos that I understand you're putting together is a critical analysis of the SDS-40 versus 80 footage. Maybe you could tie that into the politics of the, I don't know, the different camps within NASA, because if any of those pieces of footage do show some indication that somebody has anti-gravitational technology, then the people at large should have that in their quiver of possibilities to consider whether or not, we will really be in the space age, or whether, as McLuhan thinks, we're just going to plod along like actually everything's happening in the last century and not really get with it in the 21st century. And we'll see you later.
Okay, thanks, Randy. That opens up, unfortunately, a tremendous can of worms, because it's not just does NASA have the scientific and technical wherewithal to do it differently from rockets and the shuttle and Newton's third law and reaction devices and stuff like that. But we know that there is a technology that was developed under black programs in the DoD, Defense Department, photographed by people that I know, like Fred Francis took a camera crew out and parked them on a mountain overlooking a desolate region of Nevada called Area 51. And one night on the image intensifier grainy videotape that they produced, you can see these objects cavorting over the mountains, over Groom Lake. Obviously not aerodynamic, obviously not rockets, obviously not airplanes or helicopters. And Francis on the video is intoning as a voiceover, objects behaving in direct violation of the current laws of physics. And what was remarkable about the whole piece is that when he tossed it back to Tom Brokaw, who was anchoring in New York in the studio, what Brokaw asked was nothing about this dumbfounding tour de force of a violation of what we historically have thought was an immutable law of gravity, and an obvious demonstration of a technology somehow under U.S. control that with abandon could violate those conventions. Brokaw asked Francis, well, is it under budget? I mean, the myopia of a monetary question against the universe beckoning and the farthest star accessible to human exploration. It was the quintessential example of why the major media are no more the early warning system of the human species than my cat. Because they're looking at the wrong end of the telescope. They're looking at the wrong planet. They're looking at the wrong reality. Yes, Randy, we know how to control gravity. There is overwhelming evidence documented in military studies, in conferences, in intimations of hardware that's been photographed by official NASA shuttle video and downlinked live, which we have, pieces of, that someone under our own political aegis, meaning the U.S. or some power on this planet, knows how to control gravity and build vehicles that can manipulate gravity and can go anywhere in hours where normally it takes literally years or decades to get there with rockets. Now, where the rubber meets the road is that in a few days, a few hours, if we want to be metaphorical, there will be leaving for Saturn from Cape Canaveral a very controversial NASA mission called Cassini. And on board Cassini are 72 pounds of plutonium, required, we are told, to provide electricity for the mission. They have told us there is a Hobson's choice, that it's either solar power, which means you could never lift the solar panels to provide enough electricity at the distance of Saturn, or you send plutonium and you make electricity that way, and thereby you have a mission. Well, the most remarkable polarization of polemic and politics have occurred around this apparent awful choice. Do we have knowledge of Saturn, or do we sit at home because we can't lift the solar panels? That kind of thing. Knowing of these studies in anti-gravity, knowing of the existence of the video and having it of shuttle missions where something behaving under anti-gravitational control in Earth orbit was in fact photographed, among other places, over 19.5, over the Amazon jungles last December. Knowing that if you have control of anti-gravity, you have control of unlimited pollutionless power, energy. You don't need nukes, you don't need solar, you don't need anything. You've got the universe by the string. So the Hobson's choice, the awful agonizing choice between knowledge or nothing, is a false dichotomy, put in place by those who would control not just our knowledge base and what is out there, but the very reality of a physics that could liberate every single human being, all 6 billion on this planet tonight, most of whom lead terrible, desperate lives of material lack and starvation because of lack of abundant, clean, cheap, non-polluting, ecologically friendly energy, which this technology under NASA's control could give us. That's the perniciousness of Cassini, not the choice, but the hiding of the secret agenda that the choice is a false choice. There's a third choice that is not even in the running.
Let's take another call. Hi, you're on the wee hours.
Yes. So let me get sort of this. It appears to me that the discovery of the pyramids on Mars have strong racial implications, specifically pointing towards Egypt, which is in Africa, and black people specifically. I'm wondering if KPFK, the station KPFK, and the host of the show will give Mr. Hoagland full latitude and freedom to speak to that issue. He said earlier that he attended a lecture earlier this evening that consisted primarily of people of color. And if he can specify who the host of that show was and what the relationship to this is. And I'm just wondering, is there a deliberate avoidance of speaking about the racial implications? And can you address any of that?
Well, I understand the spirit of the question, and I have, in the last 15 years of doing this, I've never avoided a question. I've never avoided, even a sensitive discussion. But I am going to avoid it tonight, and I'll tell you why. Because we're not ready. What I want to do, and what I will do in due course, which may be a few months or a few more months from now, there are certain pieces of data that are coming in, and we have research people, as part of Enterprise, digging very assiduously through certain archives and literally going to sources that are not normally open and available to most researchers. I want to be very careful what I put on the record because it is a politically sensitive topic. It, to me, is an entrancing topic. It's extraordinarily pregnant with all kinds of wondrous possibilities. And what I went to Compton tonight to listen to was an academic, a PhD, a recognized scholar who for the last 20-some years has almost single-handedly, not quite, but almost single-handedly held the position that the Americas were peopled and populated by highly intelligent, highly skilled, highly efficient, and well-developed forerunners of civilization from Africa who left imprints in all kinds of elegant ways here in the Americas that the traditional European-oriented scholarship has simply not taken note of. And what I went to, they're seeing on these images and outright blatant efforts to cover up certain objects, and no one is asking questions. And it's because everybody's waiting for someone else to start the dialogue. Big Daddy NASA has said this is the Mars that exists. And what is astonishing and very disturbing is that even with this internet, this incredible tool for distributing alternatives and new information and allowing people to dialogue and discourse, the number of people willing to break ranks and say, wait a minute, the emperor doesn't have any clothes, or he's cloning them in his Photoshop and putting them over the pictures, are very few. I had a very interesting example. One of our geologists the other night, who is a consultant, and had looked at them, but hadn't looked at them. And when Ron pointed out the things that were anomalous, Jim said, holy cow, and has now promised to spend the weekend looking, and a dialogue and a questioning process and his colleague has not been following this work at any great degree. It wasn't literally until the other day when they had a chance to sit down at the same computer and Ron said to his friend Jim, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. And Jim, who has saved thousands of these pictures on his computer for the Parsons Engineering Company, has a colleague that he's worked with for many years. And the two have kind of drifted apart on this issue of Mars because Ron has become very closely identified with the work of Enterprise and with looking at these images. He was present by videotape the night of the Pasadena presentation, and he'll be involved in the final video.